Russia itself opened Pandora's box by deciding that borders can be changed by force. But that's a weapon that, as you might imagine, cuts both ways, affecting not just others, but also potentially the wielder. So what actually happens if you decide to play by those exact same rules, but this time in actual practice? Let's take a closer look at what the map of Russia itself would actually look like if we applied its own logic and reasoning to itself. Without access to the vast oceans and the crucial global trade routes, without the main oil and gas reserves that currently feed and sustain its national budget, without strategic control over the Arctic region, and without the important gateway to Europe. If you apply this logic honestly, then instead of the world's largest country, all that's left on the map is a shadow of its former greatness. A completely different country with a completely different fate. Small, poor, and spiteful. After all, the Kremlin, in its demands for historical justice, has forgotten the main fact that people in Russia are even afraid to think about because it shatters their entire worldview. Russia is not a monolith. It's a patchwork empire, stitched together over centuries from other people's lands by force and coercion. And if you take away everything that was annexed, everything colonial, and everything held by force, what remains is a completely different Russia. And this difference might frighten Russians far more than any external threats. Let's start with the East. The Far East, Primorye, Vladivostok, Amur region, and Transbaikalia are not originally Russian lands. These territories were annexed in the 19th century at the expense of China and other states through military expansion and treaties signed under pressure. By the same logic that Russia uses today to demand a revision of borders from its neighbors, it shouldn't have these territories at all. The Kuril Islands and southern Sakhalin are the result of the outcome of World War II, not some eternal historical belonging. Karelia, part of the Kola Peninsula, and the former Finnish territories. These are lands taken from Finland as a result of war. If borders can be revised, then they can be revised in both directions. But here it's important to understand one fundamental thing. It's not about specific regions or lists of territories. The thing is, without these lands, Russia essentially stops functioning as a state, because historically, it was not built around a stable core, but rather around a process of constant expansion. Russia does not exist without its colonies, whether economically, politically, or even psychologically. But so this doesn't just sound like a theory, let's take a closer look at how exactly this logic has worked in practice over time. Not in the abstract, but at specific moments in history when Russia has already raised the question of its borders, and every time ended up with the same result. The first case is 1917. The Russian Empire collapses, the center weakens, and almost immediately the peripheries start to disappear. Finland, Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, the Caucasus. None of them broke away by accident. They all took advantage of the moment when the imperial center lost its ability to maintain effective control. As soon as the central power disappeared, so too did the borders. The second case is the year 1991. The Soviet Union was not defeated in a war. It was not occupied. It fell apart from within because the center could no longer hold the system together. And again, we see the same pattern. First, the republics leave, then the economic space collapses, and after that, the center is left with a territory that can no longer exist as it did before. The third case is the most telling, and it begins after 2014. The annexation of Crimea was presented as the return of historic lands. But it was precisely from this moment that Russia once again set in motion the process that had already led to its collapse twice before. The revision of borders from the outside automatically triggered a revision of borders from within. For now, it's only at the level of questions, not concrete decisions. But that's only the case for now. Notice, in both of these cases, Russia lost its territories, not because someone else was stronger, but for other reasons. It lost them because it was the first to destroy the principle of the inviolability of borders, on which its own empire was built. The third case, as we can see, is on the way. Every time the center started justifying the revision of borders under any pretext, it deprived itself of the moral and political right to maintain those same borders within the country. And at that moment, the collapse was no longer a matter of external pressure, but a consequence of the center's own decisions. This is the key historical fact that people in Russia prefer not to remember. For it, revising borders has never been a tool for strengthening. Never! It has always become the point of no return. And every time after that, the country never returned to its previous state. An empire is not just a large territory, it's a way of existence for a state. A system in which the center lives at the expense of the periphery, not the other way around. In such a system, the regions do not develop, they serve the metropolis. That's exactly why Russia reacts so acutely and defensively to any talk of self-determination. Not because the country will fall apart, but because the very logic that has held it together for centuries will disappear. When this concept breaks down, one unpleasant thing becomes clear. Inside Russia, there's no common political agreement, no unified historical project, and no voluntary consent of the peoples to live together in this form. There's only the inertia of the empire and the fear of its disappearance. That's exactly why any discussion about the so-called natural borders for Russia almost always ends in disaster. Because every such conversation inevitably runs into the same question. Where exactly does Moscow end, and where does everything else, all the lands beyond, truly begin? And Russian statehood, throughout its history, has never had a clear or safe answer to that question. The North Caucasus is a vivid example. Chechnya, Dagestan, Ingushetia, and other republics of the region never joined Muscovy voluntarily. It was a military conquest. Long Caucasian wars, suppression of resistance, deportations, and punitive operations. By the same logic and reasoning that Russia applies to other countries and regions today, the North Caucasus is actually not considered its natural territory. The Volga region, on the other hand, represents yet another distinct layer of the imperial legacy. Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Chuvashia, Mariel, Mordovia, Finno-Ugric, and Turkic peoples, whose cultures have been subjected to Russification for centuries. This is not considered to be a part of the so-called Russian world, but rather these are classic colonial regions that have been kept within the state by both administrative and forceful means over time. Their inclusion in Russia was never the result of a truly free and equal choice, but rather a consequence of historical circumstances and power dynamics. Kuban, Belgorod, Kursk, Voronezh, territories with a strong Ukrainian historical and cultural presence that ended up within Russia as a result of imperial expansion. Kazakh lands within modern-day Russia, Orenburg, Chelyabinsk, Omsk, Tomsk, parts of Saratov and Irkutsk regions, were never originally Russian. This is the result of the empire's advance deep into the steppes, not the natural formation of a state. Buryatia, Yakutia, the lands of the Khanty, Mansi, Evenks, and other peoples of Siberia are not Russia in the historical sense. These are territories that for centuries existed outside the Moscow world and were incorporated into it by force. Before their conquest, they truly had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with Muscovy. Without their presence and influence, Russia ceases to be not only an empire, but also the state as we know it today. And here, it's important to understand, an empire can continue to exist for decades out of inertia, even when its internal foundations have long since been destroyed. It is held together not by consent, but by fear, not by the future, but by the past. But as soon as this inertia comes up against a real revision of borders, the illusion of stability disappears very quickly. If you consistently apply the same principle that Russia uses to justify its seizures, you end up with a completely different map, one without imperial ambitions, without colonial possessions, without illusions about a great Russian world. What remains is a state that has never been great without violence, expansion, and the subjugation of other peoples. That is precisely why any talk of revising borders is mortally dangerous for Russia itself. Not for its neighbors, not for Ukraine, but for itself. Because this conversation doesn't destroy other countries, but the very structure of the Russian Empire itself. It calls into question not just specific regions or particular areas, but rather the very foundation and core basis of its existence itself. So let's take a moment to talk about this in more detail and discuss it further. After all, this is perhaps the main paradox. For many years, Russia has consistently tried to convince the world that it is strong simply because it is big. However, it eventually turned out that it was only considered big because it never truly asked itself the most important and fundamental question: why are all these lands regarded as its own in the first place? As soon as that important and thought-provoking question was asked, the map, which once seemed so stable, started to fall apart piece by piece. The Pandora's box that Russia has opened can no longer be closed or contained. Now, the redrawing of Russia's borders is not a question of if, but rather a matter of when it will happen. And it is important to note that this entire process was not started in Washington or Brussels, but elsewhere. It was originally initiated in the Kremlin by the government. Thank you for your attention, friends. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss new videos. Support the creator on Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon, where you'll find extra videos and early releases before the official premieres. Use YouTube's sponsorship feature and be sure to send donations to the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Wishing all Ukrainians a speedy victory.